Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel where I talk about books. And today I'm going to do a BookTube tag, specifically the book recommendation tag. It was originally created by Steph Bauer and I was tagged by booktuber Bookworm Adventure Girl. Now, this is my first ever BookTube tag. I've only been doing this BookTube thing for a few months and already I've been tagged and I'm super excited because I feel like I've arrived now. I'm part of the community. It's great. And I was tagged by a Canadian, which is fantastic because I feel kind of Canadian myself. I am, technically, I am French American, French father, American mother, raised between the two countries. But the thing is, I moved to Budapest a while back, met a lot of international people, new people, and they're always asking, oh, where are you from? So I say, well, I am French American. And, but people, when they ask you where you're from, they do not want two answers. They get confused. So they say, French American? Oh, you mean you're Canadian? Invariably, that's what they say. So I have to explain them my life story. And after a while, it just got so frequent and so annoying that I ended up just telling people I was Canadian, right? And I feel kind of Canadian. We have a lot in common. People often think that I'm Canadian. That happens to a lot of Canadians, I'm sure. I often tell people I'm Canadian. That happens to a lot of Canadians. And I frequently fantasize about brutally killing my neighbors. So we have a lot in common. I feel like honorary Canadian, almost. So it's fantastic that I've been tagged and tagged by a Canadian. It's great. Keep it in the community, yeah? So this is my first BookTube tag, and I am quite nervous, you can probably tell. I have to do a really good job or else I won't get tagged again. I'm going to recommend a lot of interesting books. And this is a BookTube tag, so it's different than my other videos. It's not tightly scripted, and hopefully I won't do any or much editing. So you'll get a much more natural, personal look into into my channel. So personal, even that I didn't even shave this morning. I was going to shave, but then I thought, no, I'm going to do a BookTube tag. I'll show them who I really am, you know? So in this video, I'm going to answer 15 questions. I will end up giving about 16 book recommendations. As always on this channel, there will be a mix of literary, some horror, classics, and contemporary. If that sounds like your bag, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. It really does help out the channel, and I appreciate all the support I can get. And usually here I would throw to an intro sequence, but I'm going to skip that because I don't want to do any editing. And we'll just jump right into the book prompts. The first one is a book you tell people is your favorite, which is an interesting way to phrase the question. Not what is your favorite book, but what is the book you tell people is your favorite. And I like that distinction because it's true, I will change the answer depending on what I want to convey. If people know that if the person asking me knows that I am a writer, I will try to give an example of a book that I think is similar to the kinds of books I write. So I would say, for example, We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. It is one of my favorite books, and I think it's close in style and in tone to what I write. But if the person doesn't know I'm a writer and it's just a social occasion, like I meet them at a party and we want to get to know each other, I might give an example that is more famous, like A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. Love this book. Anthony Burgess was a linguist, super interested in languages. So he created this kind of slang for the narrator to use, the narrator and his gang. And it's a hyper-violent book, but it has some interesting commentaries on psychology. So I'll often say that's my favorite book. if I don't know the person and we're just meeting at a party, because they're likely to have heard of it and they can relate to it, because I associate with a lot of degenerates. So those are two answers I would give. Next question. A book that is your guilty pleasure. Okay, that would be Valley of the Dolls. Except that I read this book recently. Oh, my cat wants to say hello. Here, since it's a personal video, I'll introduce you to Zviezda. Okay. Valley of the Dolls. Except that thanks to this book, I am no longer using the expression guilty pleasure. It's smutty, cheap, gossipy, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm not going to feel guilty about it. But I think it does fit that expression, guilty pleasure. The next question, a book everyone loved but you didn't. Frankenstein. Not a good book. But Mary Shelley was 19 years old when she wrote it. So let's cut her some slack, okay? I'm sure what I wrote when I was 19 wasn't very good either. So, but everyone just got carried away and thought, oh, this is an amazing book. It's not, but it's okay. We can cut her some slack. She was just a kid. The next question, a book you read the fastest. So I had a recent experience. I'll name that one, and it was a fantastic book. The God of Small Things by, The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. Now what happened was I signed up for this subscription service to an online library, except you had to give your credit card details ahead of time. So I did that. I signed up for the year subscription. I figure if it's a good library, I'll stay for a year. And then when I got into the library, started perusing the books, I discovered that it's mostly nonfiction. And I have no interest in reality. I try very hard to avoid reality whenever I can, so I don't read nonfiction. But they did have a few fiction titles, one of which was The God of Small Things, which I had been wanting to read for a long time. But I had a 7-day free trial, so I figured, okay, I need to read this in 7 days, then I can cancel the subscription. So I dove in, it was fantastic. I ended up reading it in like 3 days. It's a beautiful book. It deals with some tough subjects. Incidentally, it is not an erotic book, erotica, but there is a passage of erotica or of sexual intimacy that is just gorgeously created. And I will sometimes take on a ghostwriting project, and usually that's, I'll write a book for someone else to put their name on it and sell it, and usually what they ask for is romance or erotica. So I've written dozens and dozens of erotica books. I have never written a passage of sexual intimacy that is even half as good as the one in The God of Small Things. It's a fantastic read. Moving on. Question number 5. A book that deserves more hype. The Contortionist Handbook by Craig Clevenger. This is an amazing book. Beautifully crafted, beautifully written, a page turner, super interesting. It's got an anti-establishment vibe, but it also has a lot of heart. It's a book that I often recommend to people. I'll say, oh, you need to read Craig Clevenger. And invariably, they'll say, who? Which blows my mind. I don't know. This was his first book, and I don't know why it didn't make him a star, make him famous. Now, when this book, I will say that when this book came out, I was living in Brazil, and I had no idea what was going on in the literary community at that time. So maybe the book did get some hype to it, but I don't know. Ever since then, I never hear anyone talk about it or talk about Craig Clevenger, and I think they really should. The next prompt is a book that is becoming a movie or TV show. Now, I don't know about movies or TV. So I will I will allow myself to slightly modify the prompt and recommend a book that should be a movie or TV show. And for that, I'm going to recommend The Toll by Cherie Priest. Now, this is a horror book, but it's not especially violent or gory, so I think it would appeal to people who aren't necessarily interested in gore. It takes place in a small town or not interested in horror. It takes place in a small town in the United States, and it has a lot of fun, quirky, well-fleshed out characters. There's a very interesting lore to it, and the magical elements are very well done. It's a compelling story and a fun read, and I think it would be a fun movie as well, if not a miniseries. So for the next prompt, a book you have reread the most. Now, I do not reread books. There are just too many books that I want to read and too many that I can't go back and read a book I've already read. However, I will say I have read Haroun and the Sea of Stories by Salman Rushdie. I have read this book twice, which is rare. And funny enough, I have yet to read it in English, which is strange because normally Salman Rushdie I would read in English. But circumstances were such that I read it in French and then I read it in Portuguese. And it was amazing because in both experiences, I never felt like I was reading a translation. The story doesn't take place really in the real world on Earth. It takes place in a kind of dream world, different planets and such. It's a fantasy fairy tale. So the language normally would put me in a geographical location, but since that wasn't the case, it worked very well in both languages. And there's a lot of wordplay in this book because it's quite humorous in that regard. And in both instances, in the French and in the Portuguese, they just nailed the wordplay. It was very impressive. It's one of my favorite books. I love this book. Maybe I will reread it in English one day. Probably not. I probably want to read other books. The next prompt is recommend a book from a genre you don't typically read. Okay, so I will almost never read books by celebrities or humor books. However, a few years ago, I did just that. I read a book from Canadian comedian Norm Macdonald, who's one of my favorite comedians of all time. And he wrote a book called Based on a True Story, where he takes, where he fictionalizes anecdotes from his life and ties them together to create a narrative. The book was a lot of fun to read. It was funny and well done. So I can recommend that if you're into humor and a lighthearted, humorous book. Next prompt, a book that deserves all the hype it gets. So I will recommend White Teeth by Zadie Smith. And this book came out in 2000. And in fact, The Guardian named it the most hyped book of the 21st century. Now, the year 2000 is technically the 20th century, but it's The Guardian, so they're kind of with the facts, right? This book was a big hit. It won many awards, and I had been wanting to read it for a long time, but it was just so hyped, I figured I can't read it now. It's not going to live up to the hype. I'm going to be disappointed. But earlier this year, I finally did get around to reading it, and I thought it was excellent. Yeah, I thought it was definitely worth all the hype. It was Zadie Smith's first book, and it takes place in London, and it deals with immigrant families, like families from Jamaica, North Africa, Middle East, India, Pakistan, and these parents, these immigrant parents have children, so there's a generational gap there. But also the parents have an idea of how to raise their children or what their children should become based on their homeland. And the children have this idea of who they should become based on, they're born and raised in England. So there's this interesting cultural gap there as well. And each character deals with this conflict, this dichotomy in different ways. it was very impressive because there are a lot of characters in this book, and they're all quite diverse and unique, and she gives them a unique voice, and she fleshes them out very well and explores their personal conflicts very well. It's quite an impressive juggling act, especially for a first book. It's very good. Next prompt. A book you usually recommend when asked to give a recommendation. Now, this is assuming that I don't know the person. And there are two ways I could go with this. If the person asking me for a recommendation is a guy, a man, a boy, I will recommend Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. This is an excellent story. It's about a father-son relationship, but it takes place in a horror universe. So it works very well for horror fans. But even if you're not a horror fan, it's a literary work that works very well. So it works for both kinds of people. However, I do specify that I would recommend this only for a male reader because it's Ray Bradbury. And he is just someone who I think is not really interested in women. He is not interested in writing for them. And he doesn't generally write female characters. And when he does, they're just cardboard cutouts and they don't really do much for the story. Now, I'm sure that many female readers like this book or like Ray Bradbury. I have met many Ray Bradbury fans, like super fans. They've all been men, but I'm sure that there are women out there who like him too. But I'm just playing the statistics, the odds, that I would recommend Something Wicked This Way Comes for a man. And another book I would like to recommend that's more current, more contemporary, regardless of the genre and regardless of the gender, I would recommend Home Fire by Camilla Shamsi. Home Fire by Camilla Shamsi. It's an excellent book. Came out in 2017. It was a Booker Prize, shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and it won the Women's Prize for Fiction. And it is essentially a modern or contemporary retelling of the Greek play Antigone. So it's great because it's a contemporary book, but it also appeals to a classic. And it is a story about set in London with immigrant families. And the children of these immigrants, they are British nationals, but they decide that they want to go off to Afghanistan or Iraq and they want to join ISIS. So they're British nationals, but they want to go to a foreign country and fight England. And it's a super interesting story and very daring for her to write this. And I believe she's of Pakistani origin, if I'm not mistaken. And as I'm reading it, I'm gasping and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, you're not going there, are you? And she did go there, and she did it very well because she's depicting these people who are terrorists, but they're also human beings, and she's treating them as such. It's a very daring book, and she pulled it off, and it's very good. Yeah, so Home Fire is a good recommendation. The next prompt, a book that has your favorite character. Okay. So I will recommend a relatively recent read, Mother Howl by Craig Clevenger. This is a crime drama, literary crime drama, where a young man, he's the son of a famous serial killer. And so he decides to have his name changed. And then decades later, he may have to reclaim his birth name. There is a character in this book named Icarus, who has his wings burned off and he falls to the earth with a mission. And this Icarus character is very compelling, and he provides comic relief in the book. And there were many instances where I just laughed out loud. Very endearing character, and he has his own way of speaking, his own locution, and it's just a lot of fun. Next prompt, a book you wish you could live in. Now, I read essentially mostly really dark books and sometimes sad literary books. That's a tough one. I'm on the fence between The Stepford Wives and American Psycho, but I'm just kidding. A book I wish I could live in. So this one was probably the most difficult question to answer. And I'm going to recommend The Year of the Hare by Arto Pasolina. Arto Pasolina is one of my favorite authors, so I'm glad I have the opportunity to talk about him here. He is a Finnish author, and he wrote dozens and dozens of books, but for some reason only 2 were or have been translated into English. But The Year of the Hare is one of them, and A Charming Mass Suicide is the other, which is an excellent book. For some reason, he enjoyed a lot of success in France, so many of his books have been translated into French. That's how I discovered him. But in The Year of the Hare, it's essentially a man, he's driving down the road, he hits a hare, a bunny. He doesn't kill it, but he hits it and injures it a little bit. So he feels bad, he goes out and he finds the hare, who's not hurt too bad, but he decides it's his responsibility now, so he takes it and kind of adopts it. And then he just travels around through Finland, exploring different regions of Finland, getting odd jobs and meeting a lot of interesting, quirky people. And all the while, he has a hare as a companion. So this is The Year of the Hare. And I figured that'd be a very fun way to spend a year, just traveling around Finland, meeting interesting, quirky people, and having a hare as a companion. So it's sadly, The Year of the Hare is probably my least favorite of his books, but it's still a good book. But since we're talking about him, I will recommend A Charming Mass Suicide. And I will talk about Arto Pasolina in a future video I will create. Yeah, he needs to be talked about. The next prompt, a book you thought you would hate but ended up loving. Okay, so if I think I'm going to hate a book, I'm probably not going to read it. But what happens sometimes is you have a friend who gives you a book. And if a friend gives you a book, it's like they're giving you an obligation, right? Giving you a task to do. Like, here, spend hours reading this. So I had a friend, he gives me books. Michael, here, this is for you. And I said, no, I do not want to read that. He's like, no, I'm giving it to you. I said to him, I do not like that author. I do not want to read that book. And he said, I'm giving you this book. You're going to read it, and you're going to like it. We had a back and forth. Eventually, I caved in. I said, okay, fine, I'll read it. And I really did like it. And that book was Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. Now, I said I didn't like Cormac McCarthy. We'll put an asterisk on that, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But Blood Meridian is a dark and disturbing story. But it's beautiful in the way that the setting, the landscape, and the environment is a character in itself. And it also serves to form and mold the other characters. It informs how they behave and what their motives are and what their objectives are, which is very impressive. I can think about my own writing. I do not do this well. I think all of my stories could be taken and transported to another location, which is not the case with Blood Meridian. I mean, that's quite impressive to have people and a story that's so specific and tied to a land and an environment. And Blood Meridian is an excellent example of that. Moving on, a book that made you cry. I recently created a video all about that called Books That Made Me Cry, where I list several examples and talk about them in detail. So I'll invite you to check it out there. Here I will just say a play by Emma Donoghue called Ladies and Gentlemen. It's excellent, gave me a nice cry. Highly recommend. And the last question is a book you wish you could read for the first time. And that would be The Road by Corman McCarthy. And the reason for this is I read this maybe 10 years ago, and at that time, I was doing a lot of freelance editing work. It's mainly self-published writers or writers who would go on to be published in independent presses. And I was doing line editing, so correcting their punctuation and their grammar. And sometimes I would do more content editing or talk about the weaknesses in the narrative and such. So at that time, I was reading a lot of poorly written books. And it just wore me down, and I got to a point where I was becoming such a grumpy reader. I couldn't turn the editor part of my brain off, and I was hypercritical of everything I was reading. So I had a friend who gives me this book, and she says, "Here, you need to read this. This is right up your alley. You're going to love it." And I said, "No, I can't take the book because I'm in a weird headspace right now. I've been reading so many bad books. I can't read for enjoyment right now. My head's a mess." She said, no, trust me, you're going to love this book. This book is definitely for you. And it was Corman McCarthy, The Road. So eventually I broke down, I read it, but I was in a bad headspace there, and I just couldn't enjoy it. So I ended up not really liking the book. And which, incidentally, 10 years later, I had another opportunity where I was in a better headspace and I could like it. And I'm sure that if I read The Road now, or in a better headspace, I'm sure I would love it. So a book I wish I could read for the first time, it would be that, The Road. Well, I made it. I got through all 15 prompts. Thank you for watching if you followed me this far. I was tagged by Bookworm Adventure Girl, and I'm going to leave a link to her video where she responds to these prompts. So check it out there, because us Canadians, we need to stick together, right? I will say I enjoyed her video of this. Of the books she recommended, I had read 3 of them. One, she gave really, really high recommendations for all 3. One, I really, really hated. And the other 2 that I had read, I really loved. So it'd be interesting. It'd be interesting if you could guess which ones, but that would be quite impossible, I think. So I want to thank you for following, and thank you for watching. I myself am going to tag other booktubers. I am going to tag Pick Your Pop Culture Poison. And I'm also going to tag Mindy's Book Journey. And I'll leave links in the description box, so check them out. And thank you for watching. I'll see you at the next video.